YY. Welcome to Critical Animal, a podcast about culture, ethics, history, and the lives of animals.
I am Critical Bear. In our video essays, every argument begins with a specific story. But in a deep cut, we stay with the story until it gets uncomfortable.
If you saw our shorter video essay on how states manufacture threats, you know the core argument. Here, we are giving it room to breathe. Bear and I are spending a longer conversation inside J.M. Coetzee's 1980 novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, its apartheid context, narrative authority, and the uncomfortable psychology of paranoia.
I want to start with a question that has been bothering me all week, because it gets right to the core of how our minds are wired. Why does it feel reassuring, maybe even secretly pleasurable, to believe that a clear, definable monster is gathering right at the border, waiting to destroy our way of life?
It sounds entirely backwards on the surface. You would think we want to feel safe, that we'd want a world without threats.
Exactly. But there is this incredibly strange gravity to paranoia. A world with a monster at the gates is a world that suddenly makes sense. It organizes the chaos. When the world is complex and ambiguous and frighteningly random, the invention of a single localized threat acts as a psychological anchor.
It gives all of that free-floating anxiety a face and a name. It provides a unifying purpose. And maybe most dangerously, it gives us a very convenient excuse for the terrible things we might be willing to do in the name of security.
And today, we are going deep into the architecture of that paranoia. We are looking at a blueprint drawn up by Coetzee.
But we are not here to do a book report or a literary recap of Waiting for the Barbarians. We are going to use this text to dismantle the actual mechanics of how a society learns to fear an enemy it has never truly met. How do you take a population that is living in relative, mundane peace and fundamentally rewire their reality so that they become terrified of shadows?
Coetzee isn't just telling a fictional story here. He is offering a forensic breakdown of how institutional fear operates. He exposes the step-by-step process of threat manufacture.
Let's set the stage, because the way Coetzee builds this world is brilliant precisely because of what he leaves out. The ambiguity is the point. We are in an unnamed frontier settlement of an unnamed empire. There are no dates. There are no recognizable countries. It is just endless frontier dust, heat, cartloads of apricots, and long afternoon siestas.
It sounds almost peaceful.
It is. This town has been here for decades. The people trade peacefully with the local nomadic tribes. There is no war. There is no crisis. The man running the town, the local magistrate, is just a comfortable, aging civil servant who is basically waiting to retire. He spends his days collecting ancient artifacts from ruins in the desert and reading classics.
The world is steady. Honestly, it's boring. And then the disruption arrives. But the destruction doesn't come from the desert. It doesn't come from these supposed barbarians. It comes from the capital of the empire itself.
A carriage rolls into the dust of this frontier town carrying Colonel Jol. He arrives from the 3rd Bureau, charged with investigating rumors of a barbarian uprising.
Which should immediately set off alarm bells for anyone paying attention. Because again, there is no emergency. There is nothing happening.
This is the primary conceptual turn of the entire framework. We are conditioned by history, and certainly by modern media, to believe in a very specific sequence of events. We believe that a threat appears in the world, and then the state responds to it. But Colonel Jol's arrival reverses that polarity completely.
The state has already decided it needs an emergency. Therefore, a threat must be found to justify the powers the state has already granted itself.
The enemy isn't discovered in this outpost. The enemy must be manufactured. The 3rd Bureau is an institution built for a specific purpose, which is crushing treason. And if an institution's entire budget and prestige rely on traitors, it will invariably find traitors.
Coetzee gives Colonel Jol a defining physical characteristic that cements this dynamic. The dark glasses. When the magistrate first meets him, he notes that Jol is wearing something he's never seen before. 2 little discs of dark glass suspended in front of his eyes in loops of wire. Jol claims it's just a new invention from the capital to protect his eyes from the harsh desert glare.
But those dark glasses are far more than a practical accessory. They function as a structural feature of the imperial mindset. They create a one-way mirror. Jol can observe, scrutinize, and categorize everyone around him, but no one can look back into his eyes. They block out the glare of the sun, certainly. But more importantly, they fundamentally block out the humanity of the people he is surveying.
Because if you're actively looking for an enemy, you can't afford to see a person.
It is exactly the opposite of empathy. The Empire does not want to see these nomadic people as human beings with rich histories or families or individual motivations. It just needs to see them as a uniform, abstract category. The enemy. The sunglasses are a physical manifestation of willful institutional blindness.
So Jal needs an enemy to validate his mandate. But there is no invading army out there in the dust. So what does he do? He just goes out and grabs whoever's available. He doesn't uncover a secret cell of insurgents. He arrests a few completely harmless river fishers. We're talking about destitute people who build flimsy reed shelters in the mud and catch redworms. Specifically, he brings in an old man and his nephew, a boy with a terrible sore on his face who was literally just coming to the settlement to see a doctor.
It is the absolute banality of that selection that makes it so terrifying. Joel doesn't need them to be guilty of anything. He just needs them to be bodies. The narrative strips bare how the Empire requires prisoners and requires evidence well before it is actually established that any uprising is taking place. If there are no barbarian generals, you feed the system's sick fishermen.
But logistically, this presents a massive problem for the Empire. If you arrest an innocent old man and a sick boy, how on earth do you get them to confess to an organized, widespread barbarian uprising?
You have to alter the fundamental epistemology of the society. You literally change the rules of how people determine what is true and what is false. Under normal circumstances, truth is determined by evidence, observation, reality. But when Yol arrives, he imports a totally new set of rules.
We see this play out outside the interrogation hut. The magistrate is standing outside a storeroom they've converted into a cell. It's incredibly visceral. He can smell wet ash. He hears the screams coming from inside. When Jal finally emerges, the magistrate asks him a very basic human question. He asks, how do you know when a man is telling the truth? How do you know you haven't just broken him to the point where he's saying whatever you want him to say?
And Joel's answer is the darkest distillation of bureaucratic violence. He explains his method with cold, clinical precision. He says, "First, I get lies, you see. This is what happens. First lies, then pressure, then more lies, then more pressure, then the break, then more pressure, then the truth. That is how you get the truth."
The magistrate walks away from that conversation with a realization that really forms the core nightmare of this entire novel. He realizes pain is truth. All else is subject to doubt.
Let's really pull apart the mechanics of that logic, because it is essential to understanding how authoritarian systems validate themselves. In this framework, coercion does not neutrally uncover hidden facts. It isn't a tool of discovery. It is an instrument of production.
Production, meaning the state already has a script written out. The script says the barbarians are arming. They are a unified threat. They are coming to destroy us.
The interrogation chamber isn't there to ask the prisoner if the script is true. It is there to force the physical body of the victim to recite the script on command. And once the victim recites the script, the pain validates the Empire's paranoia. The paperwork is generated. Jal can return to the capital and present a signed confession detailing a massive plot against the Empire. The fact that the confession was extracted by destroying a man's body is completely irrelevant to the bureaucracy. The file is closed. The emergency is officially justified.
This feels like a good moment to anchor this in the real world, because Coetzee wasn't just writing dark fantasy here. He wrote this in 1980, living in apartheid South Africa.
The historical context is crucial, even though the novel never explicitly names South Africa. Coetzee wrote it in a country organized by racial classification, territorial separation, pass laws, detention, surveillance, and a security rhetoric that repeatedly treated Black political life as a threat to order. The novel bears that history within it. It is shaped by apartheid without becoming a disguised historical chronicle of one place or one event.
So the abstraction does not make apartheid disappear.
Exactly. It allows the novel to ask what happens when a political system turns its own categories into a total explanation of reality. A reader should not use the unnamed empire to dissolve apartheid into a generic story about human cruelty. The point is more demanding. Coetzee gives a historically specific machinery enough distance that readers elsewhere cannot so easily say, "That has nothing to do with us."
But notice the structural choice he makes. He doesn't write a literal historical novel about Pretoria in 1970. He keeps the setting completely untethered from a specific map. The characters have no culturally specific names. Why do that, though? If you are angry about the injustices in your own country, why not name them directly?
The risk of naming is that readers can distance themselves. What a terrible thing happening over there to those people. Coetzee counters that distance by making the empire recognizably bureaucratic, ordinary, and morally familiar. He abstracts from apartheid without escaping it. The setting lets us examine the structure through which exceptional power makes itself seem necessary, while the South African history keeps that structure from becoming a bloodless, universal allegory.
Okay, well, let's look at the magistrate then, because at this point in the story, he feels like the reader's proxy. He is disgusted by Joel. He doesn't want this torture in his town. He is this comfortable, decent guy who just wants to read his history books and leave people alone. It's incredibly easy to align with him and say, well, the magistrate is the humane alternative to the cold, fascist bureaucracy of Colonel Joel.
It is easy, and it is a trap. Coetzee is setting the reader up here. If Joel represents the overt physical violence of the empire, the magistrate represents something far more insidious: the quiet, private complicity of the liberal conscience.
Let me push back on that a bit, though. After Joel's party leaves, the magistrate finds a young barbarian woman who has been severely injured by the interrogation regime and whose father has not survived it. He takes her into his own quarters. He washes her feet, tends to her, and rubs oil into the marks on her body. In a brutal, uncaring empire, isn't that basic human empathy worth something?
It matters that he does not leave her in the cell. Coetzee does not make his care false. The difficulty is that care can be real and compromised at the same time. On the surface, it looks like an act of genuine care. He is trying to heal the physical damage that Joel inflicted, but we have to look really closely at what he actually does. Is he trying to heal her? Or is he trying to heal himself? He doesn't just give her a safe room and leave her be. He initiates a very specific, deeply uncomfortable ritual. He sleeps holding her, but it isn't a typical physical relationship. Instead, he constantly, obsessively asks her for her story. He demands of her, "Tell me what happened. Tell me the truth."
Okay, but again, isn't that what we're supposed to do? Give victims a voice?
That is the comfortable liberal assumption, but it masks a deeper power dynamic. We have to ask whether pity can become another way of possessing someone else's story. The magistrate wants her to perform her trauma for him. He wants her suffering to become legible in a way that confirms his own role as the humane man who sees what Joel refuses to see. But he is still the magistrate. His office, comfort, and authority belong to the same empire that made her vulnerable. His care does not free him from that relation.
So his benevolence is self-serving. He wants her pain to be a puzzle he can solve, a wound he can bandage, so he doesn't have to look at his own complicity in the system that caused the wound in the first place.
And what is so profound about this relationship in the novel is the girl's response. She refuses to give him the redemptive narrative he wants. She remains opaque. She denies him access to an interior life that he wants to turn into an answer. That brings us to a phrase from Edward Said, "Permission to narrate."
Which can sound like a nice slogan about letting people speak, but it is more difficult than that.
Much more difficult. Said developed the phrase in relation to the political conditions under which Palestinian experience could become publicly intelligible against dominant narratives. It asks who is allowed to make a history audible, who is believed, and who is required to keep proving that their suffering is real. We are not claiming that Said wrote about Coetzee's character. We are using his question as a lens. The magistrate thinks he is giving the girl a voice, but he is also acting as the gatekeeper of her reality. He wants her to translate her agony into a form that will make sense to his imperial conscience.
There is this incredible metaphor Coetzee uses for this. The magistrate is an amateur archaeologist, right? He finds these ancient wooden slips in the desert with faded characters written on them. He can't read them. He just stares at them, trying to force meaning onto the blank, faded wood. And he treats the girl exactly the same way. She is a text he is trying to decipher, but she refuses to be read. Her silence, her opacity, is her only remaining defense against an empire that wants to consume absolutely everything.
Think about the symmetry here. Joel uses coercion to make a required story speak. The magistrate wants silence to yield a different story, one that could restore his moral self-image. Neither relation grants the girl the right to remain unread. That is why the magistrate, not only Joel, is the moral complication of this story. Joel makes imperial violence visible. The magistrate shows how a humane self-image allows that violence to persist.
Okay, but that raises a massive logistical question for me. If the magistrate represents this quiet, private, intellectual complicity, how does the empire convince everyone else? How do you get the baker, the blacksmith, and the regular townspeople to go along with this? Because they aren't sitting around agonizing over ancient texts or washing feet. They are just trying to live their lives.
Quiet interrogations in a back room aren't enough to sustain a security state. You have to give the public a show. The fear has to be brought out of the shadows and made socially real. It must become an environmental condition.
Which brings us to the public square. Later in the novel, Joel comes back to the frontier town, and he brings a whole new group of captives, and he parades them right through the center of town. Joel ties the prisoners together. He writes the word enemy on their bare backs in charcoal, literally labeling them. And then he invites the townspeople to witness their beating.
He claims he is doing this to prove to the children that the barbarians are real. But it's theater. The cruelty is the misdirection. He doesn't say, these are sheep thieves, or these are nomads. He writes enemy. He is defining their entire existence purely in relation to the state's paranoia.
So what is the function of this spectacle? It isn't just about punishing the captives.
It is an initiation ritual for the town. By forcing the townspeople to witness the degradation of the nomads, Joel is forcing them into complicity. He is drawing a thick, bloody boundary line of humanity in the dirt. He is saying, this is what happens to those who are outside the protection of the empire.
And the really terrifying part is how quickly the town embraces it. The spectacle trains the public. Almost immediately after this parade, rumor takes over. The psychology of the town completely fractures. Suddenly, in this town, if a farmer's sheep goes missing, it's not just a missing sheep anymore. It's a barbarian scouting party. If it's a particularly cold winter, it's a barbarian curse. The townspeople start barricading themselves in their houses. They bring their pigs and chickens indoors. They are terrified of a threat they have never actually seen commit a single act of violence.
The empire has successfully trained them to perceive a threat through recurrent, state-sponsored examples. The townspeople have accepted the state's violence because they have been taught to fear the shadows. They willingly surrender their own tranquility, their own liberties to the military apparatus, because the manufactured enemy has become the organizing principle of their reality.
Okay, this is where I need to pull this out of the 1980s and look at our own world. Because reading about cartloads of apricots and parading captives in a dusty town square feels very analog. It's a slow, physical process of threat manufacture. We don't live in a world where colonels ride into town on horseback to write on people with charcoal.
We have to be careful here. It is tempting to make a direct one-to-one comparison, but Coetzee's novel is not a literal prophecy of social media. And digital platforms are not simply equivalent to a colonial empire. We have to respect the historical specificities of both eras. We can't just say the internet is the empire.
I agree. But structurally, if you look at how the algorithmic manufacture of threat works today, it serves a very similar psychological function to Joel's public square.
Let's trace the limited resemblance. In the novel, Joel reduces a complex, diverse group of nomadic people to a single word: enemy. He strips away context, their families, their culture, their reasons for being near the river, and presents them purely as a hazard.
What is the digital analog?
Not an identical institution and not a kernel hiding inside an algorithm. But a feed can present a short clip, a decontextualized quotation, or an image of an altercation with an outraged caption, then follow it with another emotionally similar item. A real incident may have occurred. The question is what recurrence does to its meaning. Repeated examples can make a scattered set of events feel like proof of an omnipresent, coordinated danger.
So the point is not that a recommendation system needs an enemy in the way the Third Bureau does.
Precisely. A recommendation system has no imperial psychology. The structural question is about attention. When emotionally charged examples are repeatedly selected, ranked, and encountered, they can turn anxiety into a stable category. As in the novel, repetition can make a story feel like common sense before anyone has examined the full context.
But I can hear someone listening right now pushing back on this. They are saying, wait, but some threats in the world are real. We aren't just making everything up. There are bad actors. There is actual violence. If a video shows a crime, the crime still happened.
That is a crucial distinction, and one we must absolutely make. Coetzee's novel does not deny danger. The nomadic tribes do exist. The desert is harsh. The novel doesn't claim that the world is a perfectly safe, harmless utopia. What the novel exposes is the process. It exposes how an institution takes a complex, ambiguous reality and aggressively flattens it to legitimate, exceptional power.
So it's the difference between a hazard and a manufactured enemy. A hazard is a reality you navigate. A manufactured enemy is a narrative you use to justify your own cruelty or your own surrender of rights.
Exactly. The Empire needs the barbarians because the threat justifies the system, the bureaucracy, the campaign, the suspension of ordinary judgment. Contemporary digital circulation has different actors, different incentives, and a different material force. Yet, an attention economy can make fearful material unusually difficult to leave alone. A listener may keep scrolling, clicking, or watching because the next item promises to explain whether the danger is getting closer. The old public square becomes a more personalized sequence of encounters.
The mechanism of circulation is recognizably related, even if it does not map perfectly. A population becomes dangerous in the public imagination through institutions, rumors, and repeated, decontextualized stories. The technology has changed from charcoal on a prisoner's back to an individually ordered feed. But the psychological vulnerability it touches, our desire to organize anxiety by pointing at an outsider, is old. We can turn our feeds into digital frontier towns and invite a simplified story of danger to make the world feel more governable.
So how does this all end for the magistrate and his frontier town? Coetzee doesn't give us a neat moral victory. There is no Hollywood ending where the townspeople wake up, realize they've been manipulated, and overthrow the empire. The ending is a slow, devastating collapse of the imperial illusion.
The empire, entirely consumed by its own manufactured paranoia, decides it must act. It launches a massive preemptive military campaign into the desert to wipe out the barbarians once and for all. Colonel Jial and his army march out with all their superior weaponry, their horses, and their arrogance. And the barbarians don't even fight them. Not in any traditional sense.
They refuse to fight on the empire's terms. They simply retreat. They melt into the landscape. They lure the imperial army deeper and deeper into the wasteland, into the freezing cold, the wind, and the starvation. The army is decimated not by an overwhelming enemy force, but by the sheer uninhabitable reality of the space they tried to conquer.
And when the remnants of the army get back, the empire effectively abandons the frontier. The soldiers flee toward the capital. The townspeople who can leave pack their carts and go. The settlement is left largely empty, bracing for the retaliatory invasion it imagines. The novel does not tell us that the nomads are unreal. It shows something more unsettling. The Empire's own campaign has ruined the town while its people wait for the catastrophe that the security story taught them to expect.
And the final image we get in the novel is so haunting. The magistrate is left almost entirely alone in the ruins of his town. It is winter. He is wandering the empty streets, and he sees a group of children playing in the town square. The same square where Y'all paraded the captives, and the children are building a snowman. It is a profoundly quiet, ambiguous image. The magistrate realizes he cannot write a glorious history of this place, the grand narrative of the empire, the bravery, the civilization, the defense against the dark forces has just crumbled into the snow.
And he has a devastating recognition about his own role in all of this. He realizes he was not the hero and not the resistance. He says, "I was the lie that empire tells itself when times are easy." He immediately recognizes himself as one of two sides of imperial rule.
That is the force of the confession. His liberalism, his decency, his artifact collecting, and his pity for the barbarian girl have never placed him outside the empire. They have helped make its ordinary face livable. The magistrate and Jal are not simple opposites. They perform different functions within the same imperial order.
It leaves you with nowhere to hide as a reader.
It does. And that is why we have to look so closely at the stories of threat we are told today. We must look at the outrage we consume, the spectacles of fear we willingly participate in, and the narratives of the enemy that we accept as common sense just because it makes the world feel simpler. When a story of threat begins to explain everything around us, what part of that story are we helping to make believable?
That is what a deep cut is for, then. Not a longer plot summary, but a chance to stay with the question after the short video ends.
Exactly. If this conversation helped you see Waiting for the Barbarians differently, the shorter visual essay and the reading materials are linked in the description. For future deep cuts, essays, and reading lists, join the Critical Animal newsletter using the link below. I am YY.
And I am Critical Bear. Until next time, keep asking who needs the enemy to be real.